Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today, and welcome to the 2015 UCLA Law Review Symposium on examining the roots of human trafficking and exploitation. We are very excited to have you with us today and to share in this learning process with you. This was a proposal. The idea for this symposium was a proposal by Dr. Beth Rebay. And through her ideas and her devotion to this topic, we were able to make it come to fruition. So we're very pleased to be able to host this event. Just a few notes. Any questions you may have in general or regarding disability access, please speak with the registration staff or Dr. Rebay. Additionally, each day we'll be providing gluten-free, vegan, and vegetarian lunch options. And as a reminder, the event's for Friday. So if you're coming on Friday, the events they will not begin in this room. So the events on Friday begin at the Ackerman Ballroom, which is a little bit farther away on campus, and you will park in parking structure 4. And all that information you should have received that in an email as well. So I would like to thank everyone for bearing down on crowding with us here today. A lot of classes going on, things like that. So there will be a lot of congestion and things of that nature. But we're very excited for this, and we're happy that you could be here. If you look into your booklet, you'll notice that the location of the survivor gathering is not posted. It is for survivors of labor or sexual trafficking exploitation to gather more informally, and survivors who would like the location should speak to Professor Rebay or Delita Miller. And lastly, I'd like to remind everybody that no media, no video recording is allowed in this room. There will be an opportunity for media recording and things of that nature at the Ackerman Ballroom for the first session on Friday. However, in the law school premises, we are unable to do so. And also, just to touch base again, the media and filming in the common areas, such as the hallways and the courtyard, is also prohibited to avoid capturing passerby on camera. But we will have space reserved on Friday afternoon for that purpose. So please let us know of any issues you may have. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And I would like to introduce the Dean of the Law School, Dean Rachel Moran.
Thank you, Jason, and welcome everyone. I'm so pleased that you could join us for this year's UCLA Law Review Symposium on examining the roots of human trafficking and exploitation. The annual Law Review Symposium always focuses on a pressing issue, and this year is no exception. California is one of the nation's top destinations for trafficking human beings, many of whom are U.S. born, and the problems of trafficking and exploitation are persistent in communities throughout Los Angeles. The perpetrators of these crimes prey on the most vulnerable members of our communities, including homeless and foster youth, and they use force, coercion, deception, and abduction to control their victims. The victims are subjected to sexual exploitation or forced labor, from which the perpetrators profit, resulting in a modern-day form of slavery. To help raise awareness of the issues associated with trafficking and exploitation, including how to identify and respond to these crimes, we have convened some of the most noted legal scholars and practitioners in the country. During the course of the next 2 days, our panelists, who include experts in fields of law, medicine, social work, sociology, and public health, will explore the historical causes and legal dynamics of exploitation, as well as the state and federal responses to sex and labor trafficking. We are extremely honored that California Attorney General Kamala Harris will deliver the symposium's keynote address tomorrow. She will discuss the state's efforts to combat trafficking and the need for local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies to work together in order to bring perpetrators of these crimes to justice. We are all also very privileged to have a number of leaders among trafficking and exploitation survivors here, including our own UCLA Law alumna, Carissa Phelps, who is founder of Runaway Girl. Carissa, are you here? Let's have a round of applause. These perspectives are critical and will help to bring the insights and needs of survivors to the forefront of these discussions. It is especially important that we begin a dialogue about the role that law can and should play in the response to trafficking and exploitation. As our distinguished panelists will make clear, legal institutions need to find ways to help eliminate trafficking while also supporting the individuals escaping from servitude and subordination. Our panels today and tomorrow will cover a range of topics, including survivor-centered approaches to combating trafficking and exploitation, the harms that arise from criminalizing victims of sexual exploitation, and issues in human rights and anti-trafficking advocacy and policy. There also will be concurrent workshops focusing on pressing community needs. A great deal of hard work has gone into conceptualizing this event. I greatly appreciate all of the efforts of our student-run UCLA Law Review, as well as the support of our many event sponsors. And I also would, like Jason, like to extend a special thanks to Dr. Beth Rebay, who has been the faculty advisor for the symposium, and I do think she deserves a round of applause. And I also want to thank our symposium editor, Jason Stavely, who really helped to spearhead this event. I know how hard he's been working because I kept hearing how the attendance was growing and growing. So I know that our eminent panelists will foster an enlightened discussion in this crucial area in law, policy, and practice. And I want to again thank you all for being here and for participating in this critical conversation. And I'm very sure you're going to enjoy the next 2 days. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Littleton. I am the Vice Provost at UCLA for Diversity and Faculty Development. And I'm actually on sabbatical. But I had to come today for a couple of reasons. Beth Rebay was a student here at UCLA, and she and I have worked together as both student teacher and as colleagues and peers over the years. And because Jason had asked me to help support this, and I want people to know that this is the kind of thing that shines a light across all of the disciplines, not just law, and that the university as a whole is better for having symposia like this, for having a law review like this that is not afraid to tackle the hard issues and to look outside the law for assistance in understanding what can be done with law. Where are its limits and where are its potentials? Because what I hope from this conference is not that you'll go home with a little bit of knowledge or a lot of knowledge. I hope you'll go home with a commitment to action, to make it better. Because I have found over the years that the one thing that brings happiness that doesn't go away is to help other people. You got a lot of folks out there who need our help and folks who are getting help from these incredible leaders that have assembled today. It's amazing, the group that's been put together. And as Dean Moran suggested, it has been, it's a growing group. I want to acknowledge in particular a group of law students who have been externs to Dr. Rebay and have made all kinds of efforts to make sure this got off the ground and kept going. And also to the two founders of Repair, which is the co-sponsor of this, symposium along with the Law Review, Claudia Pena and Rebay and Beth Rebay. These folks, you know, you can't say no to them, right? They ask, you say, you may as well just say yes right away, right? And so I'm particularly honored because Beth asked me to introduce her. Now, I've known Beth since her law school days, and I knew her first as a disability activist who was incredibly helpful to me. And, I get credit in the bio for helping to design the policy on reasonable accommodation for the law school, right? Reasonable accommodation for disabilities. I get credit for that. I get credit for serving as the chair of the Disability Standards Committee. I get all kinds. Guess who did it? Guess who taught me? Because our relationship started out as mentor-mentee, but very quickly turned into an exchange. And I learned as much from Beth as I hope she learned from me. But I know how much I learned from her. Beth is one of those rare people who got a PhD in anthropology and then came to law school to get some of the tools to use that in the service of others. And she has done so in amazing ways. She's currently teaching in the Disability Studies program here at UCLA, which might not exist except for efforts by people like her in order to capture the ideas that circulate but don't get expressed, studied, used. These ideas about what disability means and what it can offer. It's an incredibly diverse program. I urge you to take a look at it. It's currently an undergraduate minor, but I expect it will eventually reach the pantheons. Having watched a program, the Women's Studies program at UCLA, and helped get it to departmental status as the Gender Studies department, I can say that the Disability Studies is off to the right start. They're focusing on the right stuff and the right people teaching. Another reason why I am incredibly honored is that Beth honored me with the knowledge that she is herself a survivor of child sexual exploitation and violence. And that is a sacred trust. I think that how many people who come from that background can nonetheless overcome these disadvantages and these experiences and use those experiences as a way of going forward into the PhD and the JD, so it's a doctor, right? So I am very pleased to introduce to you Beth Rebay, doctor and lawyer and everything. Beth, thanks.
All right, making sure you can hear me. Good. Good morning. It's amazing to see you all. I'm going to have to read this. I had a lot to say, so I figured there was just no way to be completely unscripted, but I always go off script, so it'll probably be a work in progress as we continue to converse. So I need to thank Vice Provost Littleton first for that incredibly kind introduction, and there are a lot of things to go around, and I'm going to come back to a few more later. An event like this requires so much will and labor, and we got it from a lot of different sources. But I need to first prioritize acknowledging Jason Stavely, the symposium editor of the UCLA Law Review and my collaborator in this program. For all of you who've joined us, we don't take your presence here lightly, and learning and dialogue about trafficking and exploitation take an emotional toll for even the most seasoned advocates. We want to support the choice you've made in coming by making the event accessible and free, by feeding you as well as we possibly can, given that this is a large crowd, by making it as easy as we can for you to find the programs and resources you want. The planning, the legwork, the fundraising, the attention to detail such an effort requires are all in themselves major endeavors. And many students contributed to this event, but by far the brunt of that work has fallen to Jason. From the flash drives, to the coffee, to the microphones, to the ice, to the cookies, to the tablecloths, We're going to be surrounded in the next 2 days by the fruits of Jason's labor and energy and stamina. And as it's come down to it, his incredible sacrifice to sleep time. So you should know that when he approached me to discuss the prospect of planning this program together, he had no background at all with the issue of human trafficking, was trying to figure out what it was all about, and had also indicated that he never planned an event near this scale. So to watch him pour this kind of commitment into this project has been really powerful and a great privilege to witness. More than I've said to him so far, so I just have to add to the voices saying, thank you, Jason. Yeah, let's clap again, definitely. So I'm glad and grateful to be giving this address to you, and I really appreciate you having made your way through traffic to be here. Initially, I had planned a different introduction, and I wanted to focus first on the history of our legal system's relationship to trafficking and exploitation. And in the past several weeks, every time I tried to sit down and write the first words of that talk, I kept visually flashing and mentally returning to a particular day about 12 years ago. So I finally accepted that I need to start with this story instead. While I was finishing my doctoral degree, I started to volunteer and to consult for the SAGE project in San Francisco, which is a survivor-run organization for people who had been or still were in systems of prostitution, including survivors of sex trafficking. And on this particular day, I stepped into the front door of the SAGE building, and literally within seconds, a woman I hadn't met or seen before ran up to me, very close to me, and exclaimed, "I'm a person!" And she said nothing else. She didn't explain, she didn't give me any context, but some of the staff came up and explained to me that she had been sold when she was 2 years old, and she hadn't escaped until very recently as an adult. I would place her probably in her 20s. And not long before this particular day was, when she had first when she had first escaped. Because she was that little, there was no record at all of her name or anything about her birth or origins. So the staff at SAGE basically worked with the local courts in San Francisco to establish a legal proceeding in which she chose her own name and chose a birth date. And the court collaborated in establishing her legal identity. She got to be before a judge and have those things declared. It took some innovation. The judge in the case commented that they had to adapt and partially amend the procedure to make it work. And afterwards, with the support of the legal institution, she took possession of her name and told me what it was. So we all celebrated her birthday together. We had cake, and the community around her was pretty much all people who were almost all survivors. One of the amazing things about SAGE is it was really and truly run by people who had all been there and done that. That was one of their slogans. I really don't have words. I tried for a while to find them, to express what I learned from her in the space of maybe just an hour. But I kept imagining and partly just sensing from her the kind of strength it had to have taken to understand herself outside of the confines of the brutality and profound dehumanization that had been her entire prior life, and then to lay claim to personhood, to imagine herself as transitioning from object, from property, to person. One of the things that troubled and rocked me, and I'm not a person who shocks easily. I can hear horror stories and not flinch. But it threw me to imagine being nameless. And, I think the thing to explain about it is that for those of us who experience sexual exploitation and trafficking when we're very little, and I was first used when I was at least as young as she was, there's so much that's just completely incomprehensible. There's no way to make sense of it. It's hard to explain anything about the experience of violence when you're that young, when you don't have or barely have language, when you don't have a fully formed identity or clear boundaries between yourself and the rest of the world. The closest I could come to expressing it is to say that experiences of torture just flood everything that you are. They saturate you, and it feels like that is the entire world. There's nothing else. There's no other frame of reference. So unlike this woman, my experiences ended earlier, before I was 10 years old, but in the ensuing years, while barely understanding why or that I was traumatized, I would go through these long moments of re-experiencing that raw emotional state when I couldn't make sense of anything, was simply flooded by horror and violation, to the point where I couldn't think, I didn't know anything. And when I would try to recover or recuperate from those moments, I would start to notice the room around me, remember where I was, who I was, and I would think of my name. So to imagine never having one was terrifying, like losing the chance that you could have to find the way back to the rest of the world. So I thought hard, really hard after meeting her in the next days and then weeks and then on past my time with Sage, and kept thinking about it as I came to UCLA Law as a student. And what I particularly wrestled with was the question and the idea of objectification. What does it mean to turn a person into a commodity? I also thought about the day this woman went to court to try to transform and reverse that process to become a legal person. The role of law here was revelatory for me as well, because in all the time in which I'd known and worked with other survivors, this was the very first time I saw the law function in a way that was so benign, and part of the process of restoring for a person who'd been tortured and trafficked something precious and needed, giving her back her name. Not just giving her back, supporting her in choosing her name. I'd repeatedly witnessed legal institutions as a cruel escalation of already life-threatening injuries, arrest, prosecution, punishment when directed at a person who has been battered, humiliated, raped, and then shamed for those experiences are inexpressibly damaging, even without factoring in outright assaults by law enforcement who tend to prey on sexually vulnerable people, or by staff in jails and prisons. Abuses of trafficking and exploitation survivors by legal systems are a profound part of the process of dehumanization. They assure us that the entire world is in fact the world of the perpetrator, that we are surrounded, that there is no place else to go or to turn. So that was the legal system I most often encountered and still encounter in community with survivors. I witnessed girls and women breaking and dying physically and spiritually from those compound and toxic harms. So while this one moment in which the role of the court was instead therapeutic and restorative didn't simply transform my sense of the law as a whole, it did prompt me to think further about what might it take to change and struggle with law, to start to shift its norms and its structures so that there might be more moments in which survivors of exploitation could find refuge, recognition, support, and remedies within legal systems, and fewer instances in which law functions as a weapon, a kind of institutional collaborator in the process of completing the destructive work of dehumanization. So as I learned to read law and the work of legal theorists and practitioners, I looked for analyses and for other people who were thinking hard and carefully about what it would take, what it will take to use law in order to disrupt and begin to undo, where possible, the process of turning a person into an object. And I found some helpful answers. The first was in the work of UCLA law professor Cheryl Harris. I read the work she's most known for, her article titled "Whiteness as Property." I have an obligation to be cautious in talking about Professor Harris's work, which is deeply grounded in historicized analyses of the legacies and expressions of U.S. racial slavery and colonialism. And that obligation is not to collapse or equate the context she wrote about with contemporary formations of trafficking and exploitation. And I want to be really clear about this. On the one hand, I think we need to be focusing far more intently on the ways in which the historically rooted social, legal, and structural foundations and practices of racism drive and sustain the contemporary traffic in persons and overlapping forms of exploitation. But I often see almost the reverse happening, where anti-trafficking discourse puts forth words like slaves and slavery as rhetorical devices, with apparently no recognition that racism is still a core foundation of modern-day institutions of prostitution and organized sexual exploitation, or of forced sweatshop or other brutal forms of labor exploitation, or that our contemporary institutions are continuing expressions and incarnations of these older practices, which we've never fully collectively accounted for or admitted, much less begun to remedy. Cheryl Harris's work named quite powerfully the role of law in inscribing white supremacy as a system in which some humans can be understood as property, and in confronting the acquisition of racial privilege as a means to transition from object to legal subject. And as I learned from her, it helped crystallize my recognition that the capacity of legal systems to make or unmake human beings as ultimately persons or as property is fundamentally rooted in our nation and its legal institutions. It helped me to conceptualize how our world has come to be such that a young woman would need a legal institution to help make it possible to understand herself as a person. And further, it helped me clarify what I already recognized in the violent racial and gender processes I'd witnessed consuming other survivors, that there could be no possible effective remedy to trafficking and exploitation without fully and justly engaging white supremacy at its roots. Back in that same period, I worked with the SAGE Project. I was working with the SAGE Project. I invited Autumn Burris, who at the time was one of the organization's leaders, to come speak to one of the classes I was teaching in sociology. She spoke about very recently having become a mother and how it affected her as an adult survivor of prostitution to contemplate that we live in a society in which it is possible to buy a child for sex, and to think about what it means about us and our social world. Her question, posed to my students in 2003, became one of my touchstones in beginning to imagine what it would take to dismantle the systems that sustain exploitation and trafficking. As I was working on an article this past year in which I continue to write about the relationship between law and the people and systems of prostitution, I came across the Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Holt. Just curious, anybody hear about that case but not from me, ever? Okay. So I keep finding that. I've never found anyone else who's read the case. I didn't realize last spring when we were scheduling the dates of the symposium, but I did finally realize that this last month that it was exactly 100 years ago now that the Supreme Court was in the process of trying this case. This Sunday, February 1st, will mark the 100-year anniversary of the day the Supreme Court issued its decision. It was February 1st of 1915. So Clara Holt was recognized and named by the court as a trafficked person. There was absolutely no dispute that this was what she was within the court. The legal question the court contemplated in U.S. versus Holt was this: could and should a victim of human trafficking lawfully be prosecuted and sentenced for being involved in trafficking? The court decided that indeed Clara Holt should and could be punished based on the belief that she must have conspired to have herself trafficked. As nonsensical as this may seem, the court's outright punishment of an acknowledged trafficking victim is only a slight step from many of our contemporary legal practices. We continue to arrest, sentence, and incarcerate sexual exploitation and trafficking victims across U.S. states based on the legal presumption that those who are in the position of being a sexual commodity and object are culpable and invite punishment. In 2013, I was having a set of conversations about health and healing in a violent world with my friend and colleague, Claudia Pena. These conversations eventually led to our decision to create our organization, Repair, in which we focus on the health and disabling consequences of violence, exploitation, and inequity. In other words, we focus on the ways in which violence, harm, and oppression shape, change, and damage human bodies and psyches. And we work towards advancing prospects for social change and healing, recognizing that the two are inseparable. While we do a lot of work on sexual exploitation and helping to sponsor this symposium as part of our work, we also decided early on that we needed to devote some of our energies and time to work on immigrant labor exploitation, overwork, and prospects for community economic development. I shared some notes with Claudia that I'd taken down while studying the history of medicine in the United States and its relationship to labor exploitation and to racial slavery and colonialism. And I can't fully unpack my thoughts about that broader subject without starting another speech, but one of the examples I shared with her involved the publications of Dr. Sam Cartwright, a psychiatrist from Louisiana who in the mid-1800s published widely and with warm reception by his medical audiences. He was very acclaimed about the mental health of enslaved persons. He proposed and advanced a new psychiatric diagnosis, drapetomania. Anyone ever heard of that? A few people, okay. Which could only be acquired by people in slavery. No one else was at risk of this disease. His goal was not to try to describe and diagnose the constellation of harmful psychological consequences that slavery could inflict. Rather, he proposed that drapetomania, or as it was informally known, flight from home madness, was a scientifically legitimate mental illness that could explain why an enslaved person would want or try to run away. It's notable that his sole diagnostic criterion was in fact trying to escape the condition of being enslaved, which he presumed was an incredibly unhealthy, crazy thing to want to do. Again, I want to be cautious not to casually collapse or simplistically equate the contemporary phenomena of trafficking and exploitation with the legal institutions of 19th century U.S. slavery. These are not fully comparable contexts. They are also, however, related again because our medical histories of legitimizing monstrous forms of exploitation continue to inform contemporary institutions. I recognize this as I've listened to, read, and learned from the narratives of survivors of trafficking and both sexual exploitation and labor exploitation, particularly those who encounter medical institution today as survivors of color, about attempting to navigate medical institutions while grappling with the profound medical and psychological injuries trafficking and exploitation generate. When survivors can't seek care without trying to find the right words for this, can't seek care, or they wind up fleeing treatment because they rightly believe that their local medical institutions will collaborate in facilitating arrest with the risks of incarceration or deportation. It brings home the point we have not come nearly close enough yet to transforming the relationship of medicine to persons who are trafficked or exploited. The most fundamental needs, in past the need to run, in this case to have the chance to heal, are subordinated to the belief that exploited and injured persons should be turned over to those who will lock them up and take away freedoms. Though again, contemporary incarceration is not simplistically synonymous with pre-Civil War formations of slavery, I want to invite recognition of the ongoing collaboration between law and medicine in normalizing dehumanization in ways that jeopardize liberty. And as with law, I want to imagine and advance the process of transforming over time the relationship of healthcare institutions to persons whose injuries and illnesses are the embodied expression of violence and exploitation so that healthcare providers become urgently useful allies to people who are trying not to die from life-threatening inflicted injuries or who are struggling to avoid being retaken and destroyed. These different strands of learning, reading, and listening all help to inform the framing and composition of this symposium. We're in a moment, I know you all know this, in which human trafficking is recurrent in public political discourse, and opposition to human trafficking is incredibly mainstream and even popular. Some of this energy is wonderful, however unstable. We don't know when it will go away. This time is an opportunity, and this discourse is an entry to attempt to shift very entrenched social problems. Some of this collective political energy has generated concrete legislative change in California, for instance. Since July of 2011, it's become true that rather than simply focusing on incarceration and punishment only, we're enacting sentencing practices that are also partially reparative. For instance, in channeling fines leveled against those who sexually exploit youth and children into programs for sexual exploitation survivors. I also continue to be intrigued and cautiously, not uncritically, hopeful about legislative practices that focus on asset forfeiture, meaning in this instance, freezing and taking the economic gains collected by traffickers, particularly given that since September of 2012, when California Senate Bill 1133 was enacted, more of those assets are being redirected into community organizations that support victims. We've also seen increased legislative action that are at least early steps towards decriminalizing victims of exploitation, as with Assembly Bill 2040, which better enables the sealing and expunging of criminal records for those previously convicted of prostitution. And we've seen some basic steps towards making the process of navigating legal systems less traumatic, as with Senate Bill 1091, passed in 2012, which allows victims of trafficking to have increased access to support persons when giving testimony as a prosecuting witness. It might be easy to miss what an important step that particular one is, but because this kind of measure makes the chance of legal participation less alienating, its import for survivors who are interacting with the courts is really promising. It's my hope that practitioners will find and share concrete strategies to use our rapidly evolving legal system more effectively, in part through better familiarity with and more practiced application of these tools, these new tools. We've seen far fewer legislative strides towards changing the underlying conditions of poverty, gender and racial subordination, and hypervulnerability of youth that generate trafficking and exploitation, coupled with insistent and confused conceptions of the interrelationships between sexual and labor exploitation, one or the other of which always seems to be getting deprioritized depending on which political sphere you're interacting with. So I also worry that when an issue is this popularized, this widely diffused, it's very easy to forget how much we don't know or need to remember about the ways in which we've become part of a society in which it is possible, even easy, as I referenced, quoting Autumn Burris, to buy a child for sex, or to work a person to death or to devastating injury, or to frame an adult woman or an immigrant or an LGBTQ person or virtually any person of color as unworthy, like Clara Holt, of being understood as a genuine victim of violence. This is the fundamental project I believe we'll work on together in these 2 days, to the extent that we can through concentrated learning and dialogue. It's going to be a lot to process in 2 days. What are the roots of trafficking and exploitation, and how can they be destabilized, challenged, eventually genuinely dismantled? What strategies in law, healthcare, social services, community organizing, and the arts may be most effective in this project? And where are those strategies already manifesting, even if limited, are also still problematic? We've enlisted some extraordinarily gifted and committed people, some of whom travel domestically or internationally, pushed aside other priorities to share this time with us in order to be part of these days. We need people who can help us think through the economic roots of trafficking, the policy failures that have helped to keep those roots in place, the process of using employment law and international law in order to make headway, and we will have the help of Kathleen Kim, Janie Schwang, Elisa Barrett, Lara Stempel, and Anna Park. We also will have the voices and insights of Iman Matul, who can help us to rehumanize the people whose bodies and lives are apparently disposable in the service of economic profit. I believe we need to take on and acknowledge the deep contradictions embedded in our criminal justice system and think about the challenges facing practitioners who attempt to navigate those systems even remotely ethically, particularly when trying to recognize the experiences of hyper-vulnerable populations, including LGBT youth. So we're fortunate to have the support of Ann Gannon, Christine Littleton, Meredith Dank, Angela Zaragoza, and Bianca Wilson, who I believe can help us make sense of a system that continues to criminalize those it should protect. Not that I'm giving them a minor task or anything. We need to synthesize what we know about law enforcement carefully and critically and contemplate using our problematic legal system without normalizing its deficits. We have the participation of Delita Miller, Aida Diaz, Carrie White, Maria del Carmen Lopez, Melissa Decker-Cheslock, and Sarah von Hofwegen, and Jyoti Nanda in advancing that conversation. And we need to revisit medical ethics and competency, understand the meaning of healing for people who've been alienated from our own bodies, and advance conceptions of healthcare that are not just trauma-informed, but capable of critically engaging trauma as a normative production of a violent and stratified social world, generating a continuum of consequences from which none of us are entirely insulated. We are very lucky to have the work of Lorraine Bonner, Kenneth Schwang, Susie Baldwin, and Sarah Weinberg, and their collective decades of practical experience in healthcare. And I also have to particularly acknowledge Dr. Bonner as a survivor artist for allowing us to use an image from her sculpture, which you see featured on your program cover and on the event publicity. We need narrative and documentation of the lived experiences of trafficked persons here and in Southern California. We need to explore the possibilities for emerging from those experiences in ways that enable rebuilding of life and actual leadership. And in advancing this part of our work, we are incredibly grateful, again, to welcome back UCLA Law alumnus Carissa Phelps. We need community in remembering and comprehending how deeply embedded trafficking and exploitation are in the formation of settler colonial states, and in recognizing the injuries sustained by indigenous communities in that process across generations. We are inexpressibly privileged to have the support of Mishwana Goman, Julian Uggan, Robin Bourgeois, Christine Stark, Sarah Deer, and Victoria Sweet in taking up that crucial work. And it is very intentional that they will help us begin the program this morning. So that's today. And then there's tomorrow. So we need to struggle with and think about international law and the vulnerability of trafficked persons, and we are blessed to have Khaled Abu al-Fadl helping to ground our dialogue. We need very careful, almost tightrope walking assistance in unpacking the relationship between contemporary historical, social, and legal formations of prostitution, exploitation, and slavery. And we will have the intrepid guidance of Priscilla Ochen, Cheryl Harris, Claudia Pena, Nicole Kababa, Cheryl Butler, and Alina Ball in that project. And I don't think that's enough, so we need to grapple with the subjects that get forgotten, or that are too hard to keep talking about because they're contentious, or that involve just deep and contested challenges to our assumptions and status quo. And in this task, we benefit from the wisdom of Deborah Dorfman, Carissa Phelps, Autumn Burris, Jasleen Coley, Tendai Ashimi, and Karima Banoun. One of the speakers who's here in the room asked me, how did you get Kamala Harris to come? And I didn't have a particularly thoughtful answer at the time, but I thought about it later. And it hit me that, well, I can't speak for her in any way. I don't know exactly why she chose to visit with us. I did help to draft our letter of invitation, and I was careful about it. I included what I knew would be our priorities: to strongly feature the voices of survivors, to develop a race and gender-conscious conversation, to engage multiple disciplines and communities, to create an educational space that would bring our academic work into stronger relationships with projects happening throughout California to combat trafficking and exploitation in 2 days. I first learned about this person, Kamala Harris, years ago before she became the district attorney of San Francisco, because she was present 10, 12, 15 years ago, working in very direct collaboration with survivor leaders in San Francisco, including Autumn Burris and, at the time, my late mentor, Norma Hotaling. So before this issue was nearly so popularized as it is now, and I asked other survivor leaders in California, what's happened with her since? So I learned that's never really changed. While I would have understood if she couldn't have taken time out to visit with us, I'm actually not so surprised that she would agree to speak to us. When you have a space which involves survivors of exploitations coming together with allies and stakeholders, it's been true for quite a while in California that there's at least a decent chance that Kamala Harris, more than any other public official I've ever witnessed, will actually be there. I need to again thank Vice Provost Littleton, who said in her opening remarks that she was asked to support this program. I need to correct that. Without being asked, she very generously helped to fund this event. And of course, I'm deeply grateful to her for her mentoring. It has been mentoring, we're not just colleagues, for close to a decade. I also want to really appreciate Vice Dean Laura Gomez, who's continued to ask, how can I help? And who's been incredibly useful in consulting in the project, and to acknowledge Vice Chancellor Carol Goldberg, who's made time for us even when it's been almost Herculean. And I want to just appreciate their committed support for the program. It's serendipitous, I'm sorry she's not here at the moment, to have this conversation begin partly with a welcome by Dean Rachel Moran, because this is the first time I ever heard her speak in 2006, at the time as a professor of law, not our law school dean. She was explaining the importance of legal recognition of personhood, as opposed to solely vesting rights and recognition in citizenship or more formal and articulated rights. And I thought at the time that her argument was both effective and unusually nuanced, so it feels very full circle to have had her help us begin this event. Of course, it's necessary and important to thank the students of the UCLA Law Review, again Jason Stavely, and also Editor-in-Chief Emily Given, who was clearly invested in making sure that this program moved ahead. The Law Review students have collectively been investing time and energy to rising to the challenge of hosting an event that's brought in more than 600 pre-registrants, certainly a new record. I understand there were less than 100 last year. And it was a vital topic last year too, so this was really a huge adjustment for them to make. The staff at UCLA Law and our Alumni Association also rallied to support the program and have played a vital role. Many of you would not have found your way here without the work of some other students. Our amazing undergraduate interns at Repair, including Miriam News, Sonia Fan, Jessica Neighbors, and Giselle Moinzada, who are between them responsible for more than 80% of the publicity for this event, and have continued to help with the minutiae, fundraising, and donations, all those details which otherwise would have threatened to eclipse our resources. Had it not been for them, there was a real risk that Jason would not have slept in the month of January. And as it was, he has run on fumes for a couple weeks now. I want to thank our board at Repair, many of whom are already here, including those who are in the program, those who are joining us, and all for giving so much inspiration and support. And our nonprofit sponsor, Public Health Foundation Enterprises, And I need to acknowledge all of our sponsors. I tried to make time within my 30 minutes or so to name them all, and it wasn't going to work. That's an amazing problem to have. And without them, we could not possibly have assembled such a potent group of educators and advocates. So I hope you'll make sure to look at the sponsors list in the program and appreciate them. There are too many to list, but I do need to particularly acknowledge NetCE. Honestly, in some ways, the least of their contributions was that they contributed about a third of the funding for this event. But they're also partnering with the UCLA School of Law and ensuring that the video archives of the event reach healthcare, social services, and eventually legal educational practitioners around the United States through their continuing education efforts, meaning we'll have somewhere between 600 and 700 here in these 2 days, but they have a capacity to get this to tens of thousands of people, which is, it's inexpressibly wonderful. And I need to particularly thank them for sending Dr. John Leonard all the way out from Tennessee to support our work here. And I need to thank Claudia Pena, my co-director and co-founder at Repair, without whom this could not have come together. I mean, literally, she handed me my shoes this morning. That's the least of it. I also want to acknowledge that deeper study and recognition of all the roots of human trafficking and exploitation imparts a risk that as we recognize how entrenched these practices are in our histories and basic institutions, we will lose momentum, understandably overwhelmed by the prospect that we may have to change just about everything. Our economy, our dominant cultural norms, our relationships to gender and sexuality, our learned pleasures, our legal and medical systems, militaries and governments, our local communities, our beliefs, our relationships. We are up against billions of dollars in profit motive, relying on institutions that have, at best, conflicts of interest relative to their human rights obligations. We're attempting to navigate and diffuse toxic gender, racial, sexual, and economic tropes that stigmatize exploited persons and are embedded everywhere in our popular culture. And so it feels really impossible, and it kind of is impossible. And the people who understand the inner workings of exploitative systems most deeply, the survivors of these systems, are too hard to find because many of us are dead. Most of us are ill in one way or another or disabled by our experiences. All of us are living with, and at least in some moments, really drained by profound traumatic stress. It makes it hard to speak, even when we do, much less organize. I appreciate the artwork on the back cover of our program for this event because isolation is such a core root of trafficking and exploitation. The separation of a person from any refuge or shelter, prospect for voice or recognition, to the point where only the barest thread about to break is keeping you tied to the world. This is one of the most rudimentary, basic components that enables trafficking and exploitation. We can't simply expect that a child who's born into prostitution could not only escape, but then be able to rapidly articulate what happened, turn into a public speaker, keep speaking, not to mention taking up the urgent works of research, generating literature and testimony, artwork, teaching. It's taken me about 2 decades of my adult life to reach the point of speaking publicly. There's never been a time in that period where I haven't been ill and disabled in multiple ways, and all of that illness is a consequence of the damage to my body and psyche when I was very small. Survivors, even those who are out of the immediate conditions of exploitation and building our lives, tend to degenerate and die very prematurely. And when it takes a very long time to become well enough to do more than endure, that's a pretty terrible dynamic. So I was sharing all this lovely gratitude, and now I'm pulling the discussion into the terrain of hopelessness and grief. And there's a purpose. Namely, that if we can face these feelings for a moment together and acknowledge the deeper obstacles collectively, it hopefully will be easier to push through them in the moments they come up for us individually in the next couple of days. None of us are isolated in confronting this. But I'm also glad if it helps to share what I often turn to when I become too grief-stricken or overwhelmed to know how to stay engaged. One of my most common strategies is to invoke 2 words, more precisely a name. That's been one of my sources of comfort and clarity for about 20 years. Christine Stark. Chris Stark escaped as a young adult and almost after a childhood that was about exploitation from the beginning. and almost immediately after the age of 21, a quarter of a century ago, began to speak publicly as a child survivor, and didn't stop, hasn't stopped, including in moments when there was no other person to be found in any public space who could do that work. She rapidly found words and began to articulate unspeakable things. She advanced vital research, which most recently is helping to expose a generations-old international sex trafficking ring targeting Native women and children in Minnesota. She's testified, she's created, including the artwork I referenced on the back cover of your program, and she's become a teacher in and out of academic sites. And on the side, she actually runs 10 miles every day and doesn't skip a day. Like, ask her how many days it's been in a row, and she's lost count now. It's impossible, and it's almost unbearable to recognize that one person who has endured so much could shoulder so much crucial work, almost always without recognition. But part of the challenge of imagining that we can take on the deep social change projects we will have to advance in order to become part of building a social context in which it is not possible to buy a child for sex, to work a person to death or devastating and irreparable damage, to criminalize a victim of violence. This involves stretching our sense of possibility, imagining and then acting in the ways we would need to if we were all to decide that we could not bear to let this be our world, that we have to remake ourselves, with or without the sanction of law, as persons who insist that we are connected to one another and that none of us can be made into objects. So if those moments of horror or despair hit you in these next 2 days, if you think it might help, borrow my reminder. It's repeatedly helped me to breathe and work through those moments. Chris Stark is here. And I need to thank all of you for being here. The world of trafficking and exploitation is one in which everything around you reinforces the messages that no one will mind, that some will take pleasure or profit, and that many will never notice or know of your suffering or your destruction, or remember your name or know that you had one. So for survivors who were immersed in that world, I think many of us are always silently asking, is that true? Is that the world? In this space, or is this space or this moment any different? Between our audience, speakers, staff, and press, we're potentially expecting the neighborhood of 700 people who are coming on planes or driving from other parts of the state or through LA traffic to be part of the process of confronting human trafficking and exploitation. So that's what I mean when I say thank you for being here. It's incredible to see you. And that ends my opening. I would stand up and clap too. I just don't have the mobility to hit. All righty, I get to turn this off.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much. We will begin the next session at 10:30. So if you could please be ready for that at 10:30, we'll be good to go. And if you have any questions, please let me know or ask anybody at the registration table. Thank you so much.